To this Future Radiology Residents Virtual IRDR Interest Group event. Today our talk will be on public service loan forgiveness, answers from a radiologist success story. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I would like to take a quick opportunity to go over some logistical information for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to use our very useful question and answer box for a Q&A session after the talk. Also, after this webinar, we ask that you please fill out a survey that will be sent out to your email. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker this evening. Dr. Pfeiffer is an academic radiologist in Texas whose loans were discharged under the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program earlier this year after making 10 years of payments throughout training and his first 3 years as an attending physician. Prior to his current job, he completed residency training during the first 5 years of the program, followed by year-long fellowships in pediatric radiology and pediatric neuroradiology. So let us welcome Dr. Pfeiffer.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, so my name is Dr. Pfeiffer. I'm getting a bit of an echo here.
You may have to mute one of your...
Is it my fault?
I think you have two audios, maybe.
How's that?
Better, thanks.
Better, okay. All right, sorry about that. So just as a note, I don't have any disclosure. I don't get any reimbursement from any company that refinances student loans. We'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. And I don't get any reimbursement for any student loan or personal finance consultation service. I'm basically just here to tell you my story and tell you, how to go about this program if you're interested in it. I do have an MBA. I'm not a financial planner. So if you have any specific, personal financial goals, I can't necessarily get too specific on how to do that, but I do know a lot about PSLF. Okay, so I thought I would start with a case study that's not related to PSLF, just to kind of set the tone and explain why PSLF is important and who it would be most important for. I ran across a study about 2 or 3 weeks ago in which I learned about a medical student graduate who had worked outside of medicine. He could not get a residency position, and he eventually had his loans discharged in bankruptcy. So just to be very, very, very clear about this, you cannot discharge your student loans in bankruptcy in over 99% of circumstances. It is not possible. So the reason is because you're given student loans usually as an 18-year-old, and if you could discharge them through bankruptcy, then they would have to check your credit before they would give you the loan. So they're not going to do that. They want people to have access to student loans. So as a result, on the flip side, you're not usually allowed to discharge them through bankruptcy. Well, this person did. He was unsuccessful in the match. He worked some retail jobs. He also worked at some laboratories. And after 10 years, he just said, I can't take this anymore. I can't live with $440,000 of student debt. And regardless of that, I'd like to think that he could have been helped by some better advice when it comes to, matching and so forth, because he was obviously pretty intelligent. It just didn't work out for him for whatever reason. So again, this is a very rare instance, but if he had known about PSLF, he might have been able to discharge the loans through this mechanism instead. Even, not necessarily working as a doctor, just some of the jobs that he had may have qualified. All right, so before I get into PSLF, I thought I would give you a few little caveats here. Most websites that say that PSLF is a sham come from sponsored websites or commercial interests that will tell you, hey, you don't want to pursue PSLF because it's not going to work. So they have a little bit of a self-interest in that regard. Likewise, sometimes the servicers themselves don't give the best advice because it's not in their interest to do so. Once you submit a verification form for PSLF, you kick over and you become a different servicer. You become a part of the Fed loan servicing program. And I'll talk about that later. But I do know people who've been dissuaded from their assigned servicers just for that reason. Okay, the other thing I will say is I don't generally recommend that people pay for advice when it comes to federal student loans. When it comes to personal finances, sure, go ahead. And this is a little clip from the website, the financial aid website that the feds run. So they agree with me. And the most important thing that I think you can learn from my story is to not sacrifice any long-term career satisfaction for short-term gains. So you always have to consider, what are you losing when you make this decision, and in contradistinction to what you're gaining. So my ending message, if you listen to none of this, is that it's not worth it if you don't really like doing a qualifying job. All right, so a little bit about PSLF. So years ago, this story came out when the first people were applying back in about 2016, 17, where these lawyers, these public defenders actually, were applying for student loan forgiveness under this program, and they were denied even after the servicer had certified their incomes and their employment. And the problem was, a lot of us said, okay, this doesn't work, it's a sham. Well, there were some logistical issues with that. For one, the attorneys didn't really have the right sort of employer set up. It was a not-for-profit, but it wasn't a charitable organization. And nonetheless, what the follow-up story showed was that they actually won. These lawyers were able to appeal their case, and they actually were able to get their loans, at least some kind of a settlement set up for forgiveness. So even though it got a lot of bad press as these folks were denied originally, they were eventually in a good position as far as their loans were concerned. Okay, so where did the PSLF come from? So not very old, about 13, 14 years ago. This came about in 2007. So the first people who applied, or who were able to apply, would have been about 2017, 2018, that kind of time frame. You got to have an income-driven repayment plan, and the balance is forgiven tax-free. That's very, very, very important. And I can attest to you that this is true. It is tax-free forgiveness while working for a qualifying employer. And we'll go over these things in a minute here. So who is it best for? Large balances, many years in training, because the years in training count. I was a trainee, as she pointed out in the introduction, for 7 years after medical school. And you should have a desire to work for a qualifying employer. I think that's very important. I don't think you should, unless your loans are so exorbitant and gotten blown out of proportion over years, or you're essentially in training the entire 10 years or something like that, in which case it would make sense. But if you don't have a passion for public service, I wouldn't really recommend it. All right, so the right loans, it's got to be a direct loan. So that means it's distributed directly to you as a direct loan during your medical school or college. And if not, you have to consolidate them. So Stafford is just a fancy word to say your regular student loan that you get when you're in school. Those of us who borrowed before 2010 were often given FFEL loans or FEL loans, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Those were loans that were provided by banks to the students, and then were guaranteed by the federal government. So as a result of that, if it was still owned by a bank and not the federal government, i.e. a direct loan, and you didn't know that you had to consolidate them prior to 2010, a lot of people got stuck with that, and they didn't have their payments qualify as a result. Now, since 2010, all of the loans, are direct loans from the feds, that is. So it's not an issue anymore, really. But for those of you who have loans from before 2010, be sure to verify that, and I'll show you how to look at that in a second. All right, consolidation. Anytime you consolidate your loans, you have a new loan. A consolidation loan pays off your old loans and starts anew. So if you graduate from medical school next month, congratulations first. Second, consider consolidating them so that you can start right away. Another thing you might consider doing is file a tax return even if you have no income, because that'll get your income, according to the federal government, at zero, if it is zero, or whatever your income is. But that's how they decide what your payments are, is what tax return is on file. Okay, so here's where you can go, studentaid.gov, to check your loans. So, this will just tell you if you're there where your aid is. I had 42 separate loans. Some of them were my original student loans. Some of them were consolidation loans. And this will tell you, and I'll give you an example in a minute. Here you go. So these were my direct consolidated loans. This is all my information, by the way. It's authentic. The website looks a little different now. I can't show you mine today because mine are zero and there's nothing there anymore. But this is what it looked like a few years ago. The ones at the top are my direct consolidated loans, subsidized and unsubsidized. It will always keep your subsidized and unsubsidized loans apart. The difference between those two, subsidized means it covers your, it doesn't charge you interest while you're in school. Unsubsidized is interest that will grow. Now, none of that matters if you're going to have it all forgiven anyway, and you don't meet your balance before that. So these other ones underneath there are FFELs. So I had a medical school from 2006 to 2010 that was primarily a participator in the FFEL program. Again, this was pre-2010. So that's what that means. And then I had to consolidate them. So all these blue ones in this blue bracket here were consolidated with all the yellow ones down here, which were pre-medical school. And I have that noted over here. So this is about what I owed before medical school. Looks like about 70 grand or so. And then all of these medical school loans all got consolidated into these top two. So these top two are what my principal was when I went into repayment. And by the way, I never even touched all the interest payments, and we can talk about that later. But this is the principal that eventually all wound up being forgiven in addition to some interest. All right, so how do you get the right repayment plan? Well, it has to be an income-driven repayment plan. So the main players are income-based repayment, pay-as-you-earn, repay. Repay was established later in the Obama administration to give some of the borrowers of pay some of those benefits, although there are some differences, and I'll just touch on those very briefly, but I'll show you how to find out the right plan for you. These ones called graduated repayment plans, which are what a lot of servicers will try to get you into because the payments can be lower. They do not count. So why, you may ask, why would a servicer want you to pay less? Well, the answer is because it stays at repayment longer and it collects more interest. So there's something called a temporary TEPSLF, which addresses the non-qualifying plans. What happened was PSLF was getting such a bad rap for so many years that the feds basically said, hey, we got to give some people some relief who were in the wrong plan. Now, this does not cover anyone who didn't have the right loans or didn't have the right employer. They're the people with the wrong plans. So just bear that in mind. I have a friend who applied for this and got it. So it's real too. So here's just an overview of some of these. Just the one thing I'll point out to you before I get into the granularity of this is that basically you're looking at about 10 to 15% of your discretionary income. So what you may ask is discretionary income. Well, it's a formula based on where you live, how many dependents you have, the poverty line, and so on and so forth. Now, this column over here that says discharge, you could ignore that for PSLF because PSLF is 10 years, but these are natural occurring discharges if you are not in PSLF. So most people are in pay or repay when they start off, something like that, or IBR. So I was in what was known as the original IBR, which was 15%, and that kind of was replaced by the new IBR, but I had borrowed a long time ago, so I wasn't a qualifier for that, but it changed it to 10%. So you may ask, how do I know what's good for me? What's my best plan? Go here to studentaid.gov, go to manage loans. And by the way, you'll have to log in to use some of these services, but if you have any student loans, you should have a login. It should be the same one you used for your FAFSA and all that jazz during school. Go to manage loans and then use loan simulator, and it'll take you to a page that looks just like this, and you will pick whatever these you want. I hope you're not struggling with payments right off the bat because they should be zero. I'll talk about that more in a second. This is probably it. I want to find the best repayment strategy. So I hope if you finish medical school, you're probably going to be done borrowing for school. Here's another one from Doctored Money. This is a different website. And he has all of these calculators here and he has spreadsheets too that kind of auto-populate and help you figure these out as well. All right, so this is kind of the fun part, right? So this is probably at least half the questions for PSLF come from employment questions. Does my employer count? How do I get a qualified employer? Well, during training, I would say at least 9 out of 10 residency and fellowship programs count, because they're either going to be a school paying you, or they're going to be a charitable trust that's paying you through a pooled system, or they're going to be some kind of not-for-profit university, for instance. Almost all of those are cases where they have appropriate charitable organization status. So only in rare cases where maybe a private practice is funding your training directly, like through a payroll directly to you instead of through the hospital. There are a small handful of those that I know of, not very many, but by and large, your training should count for this. Because even if your private practice, even if your faculty are a private practice, you're probably going to be paid through the hospital. A complicated reason, but the reason is because CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, pay for most of resident training. So it's not really coming out of the pockets of the practice in most cases. There's some exceptions, but just use that as a rule. In most cases, hospitals do not employ doctors. Now, this varies widely depending on where you work. And I've noted some states at the bottom where it's actually, I wouldn't say forbidden, but it's highly restricted as to where you cannot have hospital employed physicians. Texas, where I live, is one of them. I'm employed by a university. If you go down to Houston, for instance, I think the Texas Medical Center has several different mechanisms for paying physicians and trainees that are separate. California is probably one of the harder states to get PSLF qualifying jobs because they use a lot of foundations to employ. So it's really, really, really hard for hospitals to employ doctors directly in California. So they use foundations, many of which are not PSLF qualifying employers. So Colorado is a bit of a gray area. I think they've opened up a little bit more, but you do see some. One of my fellowships was at Feeks Children's Hospital, and they directly employed physicians through kind of a separate entity, but it was PSLF qualifying. But yeah, I'll show you how to look this up in a second. All right, so the qualifying employers are government organizations, 501c3 charitable organizations, which again are not-for-profits, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, and then it has to be full-time, which is defined by the employer of 30 or more hours a week. However, if your employer defines it as greater than 30 hours to be full-time, then you have to go by what the employer says. Now, at the end of the day, what happens is the employer certifies your employment. So if they certify you as being full-time, even if it's 5 hours a week and someone signs your form that says you're full-time, then you're considered full-time, but these are the rules. All right, so how do you check? You have to know who is employing. So say this will be after you're done with residency, for instance. You'll want to discuss this with your recruiter 100% for sure, because most people do not use PSLF to recruit physicians. They should, but they don't, because it's just not that well known in those circles. So the employer identification number, employer ID number, which is found here on your W-2 form in this box here. But like I said before, you take a job, you'll want to ask them first. And then you'll go to the charitable organization finder. But more recently, PSLF has its own help tool. I can show you both of these in a second right here. So this is a tax exempt organization search from CMS or IRS actually. And you can just Google this and you'll get to this link, and then it'll take you to this form, and then you plug it in here. Now you can also search on the internet for EIN numbers. For instance, if it's a hospital that does employ doctors, you could look it up that way as well. But nonetheless, you'll have to start with the EIN number to search for it. Now the PSLF help tool, which you can also find very easily through Google, you have to be logged in to use this, I believe. You'll just use the start and it will tell you, it'll take you through the steps and check out your employer for you. Here's what it looks like. Again, employer identification number, very, very important. There are some little kind of side steps or loopholes for this, by the way. Let's say that you go to work for a residency program as a program director, and the program director receives a bit of a salary from a university or a hospital that is a qualifying employer. Then you could potentially use that as a means to get this, even though most of your income comes through private practice. Again, those are kind of rare instances, but I have seen them in play. We could talk more about that if you have a specific example that you can think of, and perhaps I could take you through that. All right, so I'm a heavy participator in online forums when it comes to PSLF, and it seems like someone's always trying to think of a way around this. How can I create a qualifying employer to employ me so that I can get PSLF? I would not recommend doing this for the simple fact that I have other training too. I'm in a PhD program for healthcare management. And in part of my training, we actually have to create a simulated not-for-profit company through 501c3. And it is hard. Like creating a charter, a board of directors, collecting donations is part of being 501c3. It is a lot of work. And if you spend all this time in training to be a doctor, I would probably recommend focusing on that your first few years at least, and try to get all that nailed away and help some people with your training. Not that you can't do that with a charitable organization, but to do it simply for PSLF, I don't really think is a very good idea. Another thing people have thought of is, let's say I want to go to a state that's restricted, and I'm going to ask the hospital to employ me separately outside of a private practice, specifically for PSLF. Well, if you do that, you're not going to gain any equity in your practice. And it's going to be very hard to juggle your call schedule. A lot of people are going to have to bend over backwards to make that happen for you. Now, not that that can't happen. You might be a really stellar applicant. It may be a really good fit for you, but I don't see it as being a very common solution to PSLF. All right, so certifying your income, this is fairly straightforward. So once you have your job or even during residency, you'll do this. Most people recommend doing it every year. What they'll do is, by the way, for IDR, for your loan payments, those are all going to be based on whatever tax form is available in the Fed system, the IRS system. So, you know, let's say you graduate from medical school now, you fill out a 1040, you have a zero income. For the purposes of the feds, you have a zero income and you will have probably a zero payment. Now, there are some caveats to this as well. We're in the middle of a pandemic and people have had their loans all paused. All count toward PSLF, by the way, once you're employed by a qualifying employer, that is, until like next February or March. So we've been stuck in this since last year. And actually my last 7 payments were forgiven. I mean, they were forgiven, but they were nullified by the CARES Act. So that was kind of a little benefit. In reality, I only made 3 payments based on my attending salary. And I'll go through my own case study in a second here. So your employer verification, you can fill it out as often as you like. I recommend doing it before you leave an employer, such as a residency or an intern year or fellowship. Your first one that you fill out triggers a change in servicers to the designated PSLF servicer, who is the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, which you will know as Fed Loans. These servicers all have a couple of different names depending on what function they're performing for you, but the one for PSLF will be Fed Loans, fedloans.org. And then they will count your payments every time you make a verification. I did this 5 or 6 times probably in 10 years. And this is what the form looks like. It's very easy. You can find it both from the servicer or from Googling online. And it'll show you in a minute. It looks exactly like the final application for forgiveness. All right, some important rules. So only 1 payment counts per month. They have to be 120 monthly payments. You cannot make 120 $0 payments and ask for forgiveness. They have to be 1 per month. Just recently, in the last few years, I believe, they came up with an idea that you can prepay but not pass an income recertification. What does that mean? So let's say I start in July, but I have an employer that pays my loans for me in a big chunk, in a big bolus. And let's say they offer, you know, $5,000 a year or whatever in student loan forgiveness or student loan payment from an employer, but they just give you that $5,000 up front, and you'd rather just apply it to your student loans instead of keeping it in your bank or whatever and making monthly payments. So it's out of the way, and you just give them a big chunk. You can say that $5,000 covers all 12 months. Now it can't go past 12 because what happens after 12 months is you have to recertify your income. And when you recertify your income, you get a new payment. So it may go up, your monthly payment may go up. So they're not going to let you pay too far in advance. But that's how it works if you have like a bolus payment that you want to make. That wasn't available to me back when I started and when I did most of this. So I never really considered it. But that is an avenue that's out there right now. At the end of your 120 payments, you absolutely must be employed by your qualifying organization. You cannot quit at 119, you know, thinking I'll still be employed when 120 comes through. They will call your employer in some cases and check that you're still employed. And your last form has to be filled out by a qualifying employer. They won't call your other employers if you have those employment certification forms on file, but they will check your last one, unless there's some reason for them to go ahead and verify those. But to my knowledge, I've not known anyone who's had prior employers called. Payment counting issues. So invariably, if you look at the PSLF forum on Facebook or other forums, they're all going to be filled with people who are upset that their payments were incompletely or incorrectly counted. That's because a computer does it. A computer makes mistakes. Fed loan servicing, it will always use a computer first. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be fixed. They have to have a manual recount if you ask for one, but it can take a while. That last one took 2 years. But what they do is they prioritize people who are asking for forgiveness, the end of their 120. So I don't think that this is a concern that you should really worry too much about. In most cases, I know this has been fixed. All right, so the final application, I mentioned all this already. The servicer verifies, then they send it over to the Department of Education, who discharges it. And again, this is something a little bit about the pandemic. Last year, about a year ago, I should say this has been extended even further, I think. These months all count. So reasons for lack of success. So why did it get such a bad rap? Well, there's lots of reasons. Some people didn't have the right loans. I mentioned FFELs before. Private loans, if you have refinanced your loans through a private lender, this no longer applies to you. You lost your ability for public service loan forgiveness. So think very carefully. And for that reason, most people stay in the federal system through training. So, but if you sold them to somebody at a lower rate, they can't help you. The feds can only discharge loans that they own. They cannot discharge private loans. If you didn't have 120 monthly payments, so a lot of people fill out their applications. They said, hey, forgive my loans or whatever, but it wasn't 120 payments since the act was passed in 2007. And then some people feel that, or if they fill out the wrong application, if they fill out the forgiveness application instead of the employment verification, then it counts. It's just a snafu. It's not a big deal. It doesn't hurt your application. It doesn't like lose those payments or anything. It just gets recorded as a forgiveness application that didn't go through. So here are some of these major reasons according to this article here. Wrong loan, wrong repayment plan. Obviously, more than one of these things can be true. So this is my case study. I already told you I accumulated most of my earlier loans through FFEL, enrolled in the old IBR, which is 15% of disposable income. My servicer lost its contract and my loans were transferred. By the way, my story is detailed here in far more detail on Ben White's blog, and you can read all of his stuff on benwhite.com. And he also has a book, which I'll reference later, which he has for free that you can get on his website. There's a lot more detail about all of this. All right, so my first PSLF employer certification was filed. Loans were transferred to the Fed loan servicer, graduated residency in 15, first fellowship, second fellowship. I switched to repay. This became available, I want to say in about 14 through 15 or 16. So I switched to it. It came about through an executive order, but it was the main thing about repay is it includes your spouse's income. You cannot get around including your spouse's income on that one. So if you are married, think about that. But like I said, you can use the loan simulator and figure that out. All right, I enrolled in an MPH program in 2017. So my loans accidentally went into forbearance. So I lost a month in which I could make a payment. So most people probably won't do that, but I thought I would point that out. They miscounted the payments at least twice. My last 7 payments for a total of over $14,000 were nullified by the pandemic. And then one day while I was, sitting there at my workstation last year, I got this lovely message from the loan servicer, and I filled out my last application, which was this. As you can see, it looks just like the other one. Filed it in October. I left my job, and then I have my application approved in 2021. Importantly, I resigned after they had certified my last payment. And then I got this. So yay. All right. So just some big picture considerations that I thought I would talk about. I lost money on this, and I'll show you why in a second here. But the difference in income that I lost by not going to a private practice job was probably more than what I had forgiven, even after taxes. So yeah, that can be a big deal. Like, it's something I never really thought of. I'm happy with my job. Like, I worked with a lot of great people, and I loved working with the residents and so on. But this was not a financial benefit for me. It truly was public service loan forgiveness. I took a pay cut to work in public service, and the federal government forgave my loans based on that contract. So this is just kind of a cute little graphic I thought I would show you. I'm sure many of you have heard of this show if you haven't seen it. But I think this really applies to a lot of people on their first job. You know, they're very ambitious. You're brand new attending. You want to do all this stuff. You want to teach all these residents. You want to publish all these papers. You want to prove you're productive. And it can get very, very, very stressful. So keep that in mind when you start your first job. So this is a slide I thought I would just point out to you as to why. And I know that I'm sure we have a lot of people who aren't radiologists on the call or who aren't going into radiology, but this is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to salaries. And I don't know if you can read these numbers very well or not, but on this axis on the side over here is cost compensation per work unit. So I won't go into what an RVU is, a relative value unit, but you'll learn that in time. So this is how much you make for the effort that you put in, and this is how many work units you have at the bottom. So radiology is this bubble over here. So because radiologists can produce work units very quickly, we have lots. We have probably the most in medicine. So even though we get cuts in our payment, like if people order exams that aren't indicated, it obviously doesn't get reimbursed in many jurisdictions. But we can ramble through those work units really, really fast. So our income goes way up. So a private practice doc will make, you know, on the order of what's shown here, close to $500,000 a year. Well, my contract was almost $200,000 less than that when I started. Now, I don't expect that everyone starting out the gate would get average compensation, but if you're in a private practice, you get equity and you can get closer to that and for a longer term. So if you wind up salaried or employed, they don't necessarily have to raise your salary at all. And that could be the case in a lot of academic endeavors. So I hope I don't dissuade anyone from any potential careers or whatever. And I use a non-biased source for this information here. But if you want, sometime I can teach you how doctors get paid. That's a very interesting exercise in itself. Anyway, not today. So some advice after 120 payments: keep all your bank statements and pay stubs. Keep a log of everything yourself. Again, on the Doctored Money website, I think there's a spreadsheet that will help you do that if you want to use that. Don't be discouraged by glitches. And there's an ombudsman through the PSLF program to help you if you need help. So summary, the government really does forgive these loans. It is a real thing. I'm living proof. Don't let PSLF take over your psyche. So like a lot of people I talk to online, they are in it to win it from start to finish. They're like, I am definitely going to have a PSLF employer. Keep a big picture frame of reference in mind, because what happens is, if you're like me, I became very, very specialized in my training. Well, that limited my employment opportunities. And then in the employment opportunities that I did have, it put me in small call pools. So you wind up, if you're the only one in town who knows how to do something, then that means you're responsible for doing it almost all the time, or a lot of the time, if there's a small number of you in that pool. So many of the reasons that people have been denied are justified and avoidable. And hopefully this is kind of just a bare bones description of how to get into the program. Again, there are some more references here. Ben White is a friend of mine. I should disclose that. He wrote a great book about student loans and has a lot more detail that goes past this into the private loans and all that kind of stuff too, if you're interested in that. And like I said, his book, he has available online for free. He asked me to point that out. So just some baby steps. If you're finishing medical school now, what to do is pretty straightforward. Make sure you have your income, fill out a 1040 if you'd like to prove to the government that you don't have an income, or you have a small one, or whatever it is at this point. Consolidate your loans if you're interested in federal loans. Right now, the payments are all going to be zero no matter what. So as soon as you have a qualifying employer, your 120 payments would start. And then you can just go from there if you'd like. Now, if you never want to do academics or any kind of qualifying job, then, you can keep that in your mind too. But anyway, I'll go ahead and leave it at that and take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pfeiffer, for being our valued speaker this evening and for sharing your story and journey navigating through the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Plan. Next on our agenda this evening is our question and answer session. So I'll begin with one of the ones that were entered into the chat. If you have a full-time PSLF qualifying job, but also moonlight on the side at something non-qualifying, will you be able to qualify for PSLF, albeit pay higher monthly payments before forgiveness?
Yes, if you have a full-time job that's qualifying and you have an employer that will, say, hey, you're a full-time employee here and you have that, employer identification number, absolutely, you will still qualify. But, you're wise to point that out if you have some income on the side that your loan payments will probably be higher just because you'll have a higher income. And one thing I didn't go into detail there, since they use your income from the most recently available tax year. So like, let's say 2020 was going to be my final year in repayment. Because I had recertified my loans or my income every December, when I would recertify in December, it would be before I had filled out taxes on that year that I had just completed, that calendar year. So say at the end of 2019, my tax form that was on file was 2018. I hadn't filed my 2019 taxes yet. So when I went to 2020, 2018 was the first calendar year that I was a full attending that whole year. That is why I only had those 3 payments before the pandemic happened, based on my full attending salary. So yeah. And another thing I didn't go into detail on here, keep in mind that whatever salary that you're given, it's not going to be your full taxable income. Like ideally you'll have some retirement benefit, or you'll have something that lowers your taxable income. So, and you should always take advantage of those retirement tax shelters and whatnot when you get out there working. Even if you're a resident, I mean, most people would recommend that you try to get an IRA or something, a Roth or something like that, just to set up your retirement, get it going. Don't get too crazy with it. Don't be using it to trade, GameStop or anything. But just be careful. But most people would advise doing that.
Okay. Our next question we have here is, do you think that out of all the medical specialties, radiology is one where finding PSLF qualifying jobs are less common?
No, I don't. I think that in most cases, the PSLF qualifying jobs will probably parallel those that are aligned with training programs. So because radiology doesn't, ideally, this isn't really true 100%, but ideally training programs are supposed to have a capacity that matches or approximates the need for doctors. So, super competitive specialties have a cap on the number of residents that they'll take, ideally because there are only so many of those specialists needed. So I can't think of a scenario in my head where radiology would be more difficult. So since I'm a radiologist, I can just tell you straight up that 75% of us are in private practice. About 25% are academic. Now, those terms are a little gray. Some people have jobs that they call privatemic or hybrid. I'm not so sure that I really buy into that necessarily, because if you're sending a bill to the patient and you're collecting it, you're basically a private practice. And if you're in that situation, you're incentivized for your work productivity. You're not incentivized for publishing papers and so on and so forth. So I think that, that definition can be difficult sometimes, but in general, radiology, I can't really think of a reason why, because in most cases if you're training doctors, in most cases, not all, you're probably going to be in a qualifying position. And I can't think of a reason why radiology would be worse off than that. Now, there's a lot of reorganization in radiology right now. The number of practices nationally is a lot lower because of consolidation and private equities, buying practices, employing doctors, but the practices that they're buying they were never qualifying, employers or practices anyway. So I can't think of a good reason why it would be much different in radiology than others.
Thank you for answering that. We have a few more questions here. Next is, what are your thoughts on enrolling in PSLF during residency and fellowship and then refinancing with a private lender? What are the pros and cons to consider?
Good question. So, yeah, and by the way, I hope Ben doesn't mind me calling his story out too much, because that's exactly what he did. If you read any of Ben White's book, there, he'll talk a lot about that. But so the pro of doing it that way is to keep your options intact. So let's say you're not quite sure, or you don't have job offers yet, or you finish 5 or 6 or 7 or however many years of training, 3, whatever it may be, and then you decide all of a sudden, hey, I got this really great higher paying job in private practice, and I don't actually, want to do an academic or a qualifying job anyway, and then I can just go ahead and refinance at that point. So yeah, that's great. The pro is to keep those options open. The con is that the interest rate is often a little bit higher inside the federal system. So that interest will accrue up on you a little bit, probably more so. A lot of those private finance companies, I don't really want to advertise for one over another for obvious reasons, but they'll often offer you a lower rate, or they'll offer you 0 payments during training or whatever, under the auspice that it will accrue interest in some cases, or after a number of years. They all have different deals, and those deals change all the time. But I mean, a perfect example, when I was in medical school, the recession of 2008, 2009 happened, and nobody was lending. Like, it was even to get a home, the federal government had to have a stimulus for first-time home buyers, which I benefited from. But at that time, things like physician mortgages weren't happening either. Like, it was just really hard to get loans because the capital wasn't there. But so I'd say, yeah, the pro is to keep your options open. The con would be just a little bit of the interest. But if you feel in your training that I absolutely want to be a practice owner, I want to be in a private practice, and I don't want to do anything qualifying, then I would probably make that decision probably as quick as possible, just knowing, of course, that you forfeited your rights to PSLF.
Okay, next question here is, I may have missed this, but is there a time limit to consolidate loans?
There is not a time limit. You can consolidate your loans at any time. In fact, I consolidated mine many times before medical school. So, and by the way, before I went to medical school, there was no such thing as PSLF. So I didn't do it for that reason. I just only wanted to have one payment. So yeah, but no. But one thing to remember is that if you consolidate, your 120 payment starts back at 0. So, if you have, let's say if you have several loans, for instance, and you have like 3 big ones and 2 little ones, and the 3 big ones are you want to put towards PSLF, but you feel like you could pay off the little ones first or something to that effect, and you could do that and without consolidating them. But yeah, no, you can consolidate at any time as long as they are federal loans. You cannot consolidate a private loan with a federal loan.
Okay, so when asked here, do you ever use a financial planner?
Do I use a financial planner personally? No, I do not. I don't have anything against financial planners. The reason that I don't use a financial planner is because I'm just a single person with no dependents, and I have a very high risk tolerance, and it's just simpler for me. I do have an MBA, so I guess I have some knowledge on finance and how the economic structure works in the United States. So I don't feel that I would be getting as much personally out of a personal financial planner. As I said at the beginning, I don't really think anyone should ask for professional advice for federal student loans, because there's so much information out there on the internet, or these books or these references that I've mentioned. I think the federal government has done a very good job at trying to be transparent and trying to help people with their loans and so on. But when it comes to the private stuff, financial planners can be helpful for estate planning, for helping you with, like, if you want to get into real estate investment or private equity, they might be able to provide some kind of guidance as to what kind of a distribution you should consider, as to where you want to put your money and all of that. Like I said before, I just usually buy stock personally. So it wouldn't help me per se, but I certainly don't have anything against financial planners. Just as long as you understand, the services that you're paying for and how much you're paying for them. I think that's the big thing, because that can be less transparent in some cases. But if you have a good relationship with your financial planner, I don't have any problem with it. Also, you can use some resources like White Coat Investor or his blog or book. He has lots of information out there. There's really kind of two levels to personal financial planning. There's the basics, which are your retirement plans and your easy tax shelters and things like that, which everyone should consider. And then there's like the more aggressive things like investing and things like that. And that's going to depend a lot on what your income is and what you're comfortable with, and what your spouse and family and all those people in your life are important to you are comfortable with. So that's going to be a lot of variable elements in a lot of decision making.
We have two questions here that are a bit similar. Is there a specific cutoff to loan principal in your mind where PSLF doesn't make sense to you? And someone again said, do you think there's a debt load where it starts to become necessary to look for PSLF jobs?
So I don't think I would ever use the word necessary. Again, it will depend on a little bit about, how should I say this? How comfortable you are with debt. So let's say you're a United States senator or a government official. If you are in the federal government, you're incredibly comfortable with debt, right? Like it's like 23 trillion or something like that, right? Like, don't quote me on that, but it was only a few trillion when I was a kid. So yeah, businesses by and large are very comfortable with it, and they're that's how the United States works. It's funded mostly on debts and deficit spending. Personally, most people are uncomfortable with it. Now, I assume that what you're asking me is there like a graph that you can use to point out when it won't be beneficial for you in your specific situation? No, I think on the Doctored Money website, I think there might be some spreadsheets that can help you make that decision. But it all is based on, again, your family situation and your income and your specialty and all that stuff. Let's say if I go to radiology as an example, which has a long training period, if I owed less than, say, like $70,000 or $80,000, a PSLF would never ever really enter my mind as far as using that as a decision point for whether I choose a qualifying versus a non-qualifying employer, because the amount of money difference is going to outweigh that, even in only a small number of years of employment. Now, again, there's so many little, exceptions to the rule. So for instance, the VA is a qualifying employer, and they often have a great system and can pay better than a lot of universities will pay. And even so, the VA has its own sorts of forgiveness programs, if you can work it into your contract, that will actually make the payments stepwise throughout your employment rather than one big bundle at the end. That's something I didn't say earlier. This is an all or nothing thing, PSLF. It's 120 payments, or if you have 119, you don't get any partial forgiveness. There is no such thing. Now, so yeah, that's my feeling about, say, like if you're in a well compensating specialty and a lower, debt amount, I probably wouldn't worry about it unless it started to get well over six figures. And even then, like I said, in my example, it wasn't financially beneficial. Now, if it runs so high that it becomes absolutely necessary, geez, the answer is yes. And you can always go to the PSLF forum on Facebook, and instead of asking me directly, you'll get like 10 or 20 answers from people all over the country that way. And they might even have more familiarity with where you're living and so forth. But if you owe, so, $400,000 or $500,000, particularly if you went to a private medical school, or you had some time, a gap where there was some interest that accumulated on your debt that was unaccounted for. There's not an exact number, but geez, if I owed that much, and especially if I was in a lower compensating job, like the gentleman I noted at the beginning of the talk, for instance, there was no way he was ever going to be able to pay off $440,000 in debt, like working, at routine non-medical sorts of jobs. So in his case, PSLF would have been good, but he didn't know that. So he had to choose bankruptcy. And he got actually probably kind of lucky in getting it discharged through bankruptcy, because as I said, that's almost a impossible thing. But if you have questions about that, there are some loan, you can check your payments through loan calculators or spreadsheets that you can make yourself and with your own numbers and try to guess as to what that's going to be. My feeling is that most specialized doctors probably don't have hard, fast rules because their incomes can be great. And by the way, as we speak today, you have to pay your student loans back with taxable income. So unless your employer has a payment plan for you that they can do outside of a taxable realm, which I'm not aware of, but it's possible, I suppose. It's going to be taxable income for the most part.
Okay, next question here is, as a single person with one income next year as a PGY1, is there a difference between pay versus repay?
So the main difference between those two programs, I think, is when you took your loans out, they're both 10% of discretionary income. And if you don't have a spouse, then I think your payments are going to be the same. And actually, they're going to be zero for now because of the pandemic. But what you can do is, if you have questions about that, you can just run your income and whatnot through the student loan simulator, and it'll give you a payment for both of them. So the main thing between those two plans, besides the spousal contribution of income, is that I was never eligible for pay as you earn because it became available for people who borrowed after when I borrowed. So if you qualify for pay, and then, I mean, anyone can qualify for repay regardless of when they took their loans out. But most people probably choose pay, I would guess, but I can't see how it would be different if you qualify for both of those.
Someone asked here, is this 120 consecutive payments or just 120 payments?
Any 120 payments. So if you go to work for a university of X and then you stop for 2 years and go to work for private practice Y, and then you come back and work for a charitable organization Z, after you're done working for the private practice, you will pick back up where you left off before. They do not need to be consecutive.
Okay, next question here is, this was kind of touched upon, but I've read that it is not smart to refinance with the private company until after residency because the repay plan covers some of the interest accruing. So the refinance interest rate will not be better. Can you explain that? I may be understanding it correctly.
You said what about the refinance? Can you?
Sure, it says, I read that it is not smart to refinance with a private company until after residency because the repay plan covers some of the interest accruing, so the refinance interest rate will not be better.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Like, so if you're in the federal system, you do get a benefit of some of your interest, right? The amount of interest to keep from having what's called negative amortization, meaning your loans go up faster than you're bailing water out of a ship that's sinking faster than you can, meaning that like your payments don't cover the interest. For that reason, repay does have that a benefit to it. But geez, if you're paying 6% and repay and you're getting, a little bit of it repaid or covered by the feds, if your private finance company is willing to give it to you for 3%, it might be a better deal to refinance. Question mark in my mind. I don't know. It would all just depend on the deal that you have in front of you, as to whether it would make sense or not. But yeah, if you refinance in residency, your PSLF is gone. So that would be the downside of that.
Thank you for answering all these questions for us, Dr. Pfeiffer, and for doing this talk for us. That actually concludes this event for this evening. I just want to let everyone know if they can please answer the survey that'll be emailed to them. That would be wonderful to us. And I believe this video will be uploaded to YouTube at some point. And everyone, please just look forward to future radiology residents virtual IRD or interest group events coming up. And that concludes this evening. Thank you everyone for attending.